you're ready to wake up, you're going to wake up. And if you're not ready, you're going to stay pretending that you're just poor little me.
Do you feel it?
Yes, we do.
A worldwide awakening is upon us. Welcome to the Universal Consciousness Show.
The Universal Consciousness Show,
where we explore topics such as UFOs, aliens, banned medical cures, as well as classified secret knowledge. Come question your holographic existence. Share experiences from the other side. This is a show that will expand your mind as we decrypt the symbolic messages locked away deep within your DNA. And now, your guides for this magical journey. The hosts of the Universal Consciousness Show, Avi Nast and Diana Seraphim.
Hello, everybody. Here we are again with another Universal Consciousness Show. How is 2020 treating you so far? We just had a little bit of a taste of it. We got 11/12 of it left. So look forward to the good stuff, because it's coming. And this is going to be one of the most interesting years that you have ever gone through. And of course, here you are listening to the show for the Thinking Global Citizen. My name is Agi and I'm one of the hosts, and I have my co-host with me over in Germany. Then there is Diana.
Hello, everyone.
All right. Well, before I introduce the guest, I want to tell you how you can connect with us also. You can visit us at our website as www.universal-consciousness-show.com. Or we are also on YouTube with the same name, Universal Consciousness Show. And please subscribe to our channel while you're there, because that'll help us a lot. And you know how it works. Click on the little bell next to that red subscribe button so you can get notifications when the new shows come up. Then where you will stay informed. And of course, you can also, if you like, if you like to hear this show again, you will find us at the website, universal-consciousness-show.com, and we're on YouTube. It'll be probably a day or so before we get up there. And of course, also we are in the archives at KCOR Radio in Las Vegas, and that's at kcorradio.com. And there you can go into the archives and look under Universal Consciousness Show, and we are also on Twitter, iTunes, TuneIn, Alexa, Facebook, and a few other places that we place it on. So it is out there. You will find us. And if you are listening on KCOR Radio, the website, there is a wonderful little feature down at the bottom there. There's a donate button. If you like what you hear, we would love to hear from you that way also. If you can show a little gratitude, that'd be wonderful. But if you can't, that is okay, because we love for you to be here. Gosh, it's so good to have you. Otherwise, it would be just me and Diana sitting here, and that wouldn't be any fun at all. So anyway, I want to introduce the guest to us. And we have David Collis returning to the Universal Consciousness Show. And he's a native of Southern California, now living in Tucson, actually on the other side of town from where I am. And he has done a lot. And I want him to explain some of that. He said he characterizes his life as a quest driven by the romance of exploration. Wow, don't that sound good? And also by invention. And he did that by following his dream, and he has become a world traveler and explorer. He's also a student of old world history. And that is what we're going to spend a fair amount of time on tonight, because there's some really interesting stuff back there. And he also studied religious history, that may not be quite the same as the real old world history, because organized religion, they seem to have their own agenda, so things might be changed a little bit. And then he had some incredible experiences where he was in contact with an entity, a consciousness, which in my research of the surviving Roman records, I found the name to be Joshua Beth Halachma. But of course, you know him as Jesus. That results in his book, Interviewing Jesus, the Man. And his interviews show many differences from the Bible. And on that note, I want to welcome David Collis to the show and to tell us more about his travels and his interview with this cool dude everybody calls Jesus. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Hello, Diana.
Hello, David. Thank you so much for being with us today again.
Well,
Just in case not everybody knows you yet, can you tell us for the beginning, how did it all begin for you? What brought you on this path?
I seem to have had an early interest in mystical experiences and dreams, and that always has been kind of with me. I've always been interested in God, and I felt like I was close to God. And then when I was 19 years old, I had an existential crisis that threw me under the bus, so to speak. And from there, I felt like I needed to search out as much information and God as possible. So I was trying to answer the question, what is the meaning of life? Who is God? Who am I? And what is my purpose in life? And I found myself on the track of exploring the humanities and art and religion and architecture. And I traveled around the world. So it was all to try to answer these questions. And at the end of it, here I am writing a book.
Wow.
And why Jesus? Did you discover a new facet of Jesus, or why him?
Well, Christianity came to me in a very sudden and unexpected way. So when I was 21 years old, and it was right around the winter time of 1980, so I'm kind of dating myself here. I had several mystical experiences, and in one case, the very first vision that I have ever had was of Jesus, and I was walking home from the beach one night, and there he was on the other side of the street. And so I saw him turn around and walk away from me, and in my mind I said, "Please don't leave." And with that, he turned around and he walked over to me, and this is all like very real. This is happening. And he came over and he hugged me. And for the next 8 minutes or so, we walked down the street. And he walked with me. We didn't say anything. We just walked and just kind of enjoyed each other's company. And as we rounded the corner for me to go home, I saw him leave, and I says, "Please don't leave." And he said to me, he turned around and he says, "I never have." So that got me started. I also had, within the next 3 weeks, I had 2 more visions that were just as powerful. And from there, I ended up finding myself kind of in the midst of Christianity. So I was going to church and I was reading as much material as I could. And I read the Old Testament and the New Testament backwards and forwards in a very short period of time. And I was what you would refer to as a born-again Christian. I was slain in the Spirit. I had all those good experiences. And I just found myself just more and more fascinated by Christianity. It was like there was something that awoke in me, and this was where I needed to land. And so I spent quite a bit of time understanding this religion. I ended up exploring the Catholic mystics. I ended up exploring the traditions of the church. I ended up making pilgrimages to cathedrals in Europe. And I found myself wanting to know more about the history of the first century. And then from there, I really wanted to understand the historical Jesus. And part of that was triggered by the book that came out, The Da Vinci Code, because there was a number of people that were asking about my opinion on that particular book. And so I wanted to understand that particular side of Christianity, because I never really explored first century Judea in any depth. And that kind of got me started.
I've done quite a bit of research on this also, and ever so often you run into people out there that say, yep, Jesus never existed. Well, the problem is with that statement is that there are enough information in the surviving Roman records that actually says that, yes, there was a man that the Christianity or the Christian religion was formed after. So, the name was not Jesus because the letter J was invented in about 1400, the year 1400. So, the name was different. But the man was probably pretty close to the same, don't you think?
Well, from the Roman material that I was able to read, the first mention of Jesus by a Roman author didn't come until I think late in the first century. So, the Judea wasn't necessarily one of the great places that Romans wanted to go to.
Yeah.
So they didn't have a great deal of interest in it. So when they put Pontius Pilate in there, Pontius Pilate wasn't necessarily, he was not a Roman. He was an outsider, but because he acquiesced to Rome and his family acquiesced to Rome, he was able to climb up the Roman ladder, and he was then in a position where he was granted to be the governor of Judea. It wasn't the star place to be a governor in, that was Syria, but that got pretty high. So anyway, it wasn't until the end of the first century or the beginning of the second century that we're really starting to see some information written about, like Pliny the younger and the elder started to speak about Jesus. However, we know that the Christians were talking about Jesus, and so they had their own records. And what I can say is, I was looking not necessarily from a historical point of view when I was exploring Jesus, although I had done that. The most interesting thing to me was, what was Jesus saying? And what are the most authentic of his sayings? And it came to me that there was a person who embodied and spoke this incredible spiritual knowledge. And if Jesus wasn't doing it, then there's a couple of other ways to think about this, which I seem to have rejected. And it's a little bit like saying, well, we understand what E equals MC squared is, but Albert Einstein was invented. Well, who invented E equals MC squared? Because at that time, at Jesus's time, because I'm kind of equating Jesus with Albert Einstein here, because Jesus was a genius, there was a man who was speaking some of the most profound things that you can imagine, and that seems very difficult to just make a composite of and fabricate this. So I really don't accept that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. There is. He, or should I say he, existed. There is no question of that. First of all, there is too much information, and even reading the notes from Nicaea in 325, there is references to this Messiah, the Messiah, and they speak of him there, and they speak about what he talked about. So yes, there is evidence actually of him having existed.
Yeah. And his wisdom bears that out.
Yeah.
So we're now looking at the text, and because that's what I was looking at, is contextual formats, and there's just too much information about a particular person speaking in this. The other thing that was also really that I found fascinating, when I was doing a lot of my reading and my research, I was reading anthologies, and we were looking at anthologies and materials that predated Jesus, and I'm looking at materials that were roughly at Jesus's time, and then I'm looking at materials after Jesus. And what I can say is, during the, somewhere in the beginning of the first century and into the middle of the first century, there was an enormous explosion of spiritual philosophy, and Jesus seems to be at the center of it. So something very dramatic was occurring, and you're seeing it in the records of the texts.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we look behind the writings, what kind of man was he really at the core?
Well, this took some time for me to figure out, and so I had to kind of go back and forth and back and forth. So I compiled 25 pages of his sayings. And I then was comparing those sayings with what we find in the New Testament record, particularly the Gospels, to see what it is that he was doing. And then I took those two ideas, and then I reset him back into his setting, into the time, into the era of Judea, the first century Judea. And what I found is that Jesus was a very compassionate man. He was a troublemaker, which is interesting. This is an interesting kind of personality trait. He seemed to be a troublemaker.
I like him already.
Yeah, right? He's always flipping the proverbial tables. This is what he's doing.
Yeah.
He was, and this is a very, very important idea. He was what I would refer to as an entrepreneur. So he has this mindset to recognize what's needed, and he provides that vacuum. He is out there looking to promote the Father, and he does it in his own way. So he's out there as an entrepreneur would, promoting his product. In this case, it was the Father. Jesus, again, he's a troublemaker, but he's also a provocateur. So this is rather interesting. He's interested in like really kind of pushing buttons, whether it was what traditional society was saying, the conservative society that he was involved in. He was interested in pushing people's buttons in the religious establishment. There was some element of pushing buttons within the political establishment, and he definitely challenged the audiences and his disciples. Jesus was very determined. He was very enigmatic, so he would say things and people were constantly saying, what do you mean? What are you saying? We don't understand. Jesus was a man who felt inclusion was more important than exclusion, so brotherhood, unity, and love were part of his message. He was a teacher. I mean, obviously that makes a lot of sense. He's a genius, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah. He had a very, very sharp mind, and this mind was able to take current events, spiritual philosophy, and join them together in a very kind of poetic way. He's a little bit of a wordsmith, right? Jesus was a mystic. So we're seeing that he's having mystical experiences on a regular basis, and he even says, I do what my Father tells me to do. Jesus was very tough. He was very brave. He was very courageous. He's not kind of this flowery kind of a guy who would wilt under the sun, who under pressure would fold. No, just the opposite. He actually got more strong. And the last thing is that Jesus was an artist. He was a poet. So he had the poet mind. And as I mentioned, he was tough. He also had the physical kind of stature to be able to be a carpenter at that time. And I know what it's like to be a carpenter. I also know what it's like to work with electric tools. And of course, Jesus didn't have electric tools at that day, so there had to have been planes and saws and whatnot. And so you had to be pretty hardy to manage all of that.
Yeah. And I think what he had learned, there is actually evidence to the fact that he spent some time in India. And that is maybe one of the reasons why some of the things that he said is almost identical to some of the mystics from the Far East. Because maybe he learned some of it there, the wording of the concepts that they were talking about, and he brought it back. And I know after he came back there, he was teaching some things that didn't go over too well with the Jews that he was living among, especially that women were as important as men, and they didn't like that.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this for a moment. Jesus's sayings have a Buddhist influence. They have a Taoist influence. They have a Confucian influence. They have a Hindu influence. Of course, they have a Hebraic influence. They have a Greek philosophy influence, and they have an Egyptian influence.
Yeah.
So when I broke it all down, that is when I started to realize that Jesus had to have gone places to learn all this information. So you either have two choices. You have the choice that says he's an archetype, in which he knows everything already because he's the Son of God, he's the Word of God. Or the position I took is that he had to go out and learn this information. He had to acquire it. He had to gain it. He had to go places to learn. And so he was a very learned man. And I think that he went to Egypt. I think he also went to India. So that's my belief.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right there, because I found some papers showing that he spent another 10 years in Egypt on this cluster over there, right on the shores of the river going through Cairo. So that's where he spent a lot of his time, and he learned a lot there, and then he left from there going to India. That's probably where he got some of the influences from India and the Judea teachings, as well as the Tao and all the rest of it from India.
Yes. So kind of going to the Egyptian influence, there were a group of Egyptians right at the time of Jesus's death, kind of right around there, the beginning of the first century and middle of the first century, called the Therapeutae. And they really held on to particular knowledge. And I think Jesus either influenced them or they influenced Jesus in some manner. But they definitely were at loggerheads with Paul. So when you're seeing some of Paul's writings, Paul is talking about certain people that are doing certain things that he doesn't like. Well, there seems to be some evidence that it's the Therapeutae. And then the other issue is that the route to India at that time wasn't necessarily a ground route. It was a sea route. So Jesus would have to get to the Red Sea, get to present-day Yemen, and from Yemen, a port there with the trade winds that would blow to the east, he would be able to get, the boat would take them to the west coast of India.
That would make sense.
Yes.
Because most of the traffic went by sea. Though there were land routes, camel routes, but they usually lasted shorter. They didn't go for thousands of miles. They just they were shorter trips.
And the Silk Road didn't open up until in the 2nd century. So
yeah. And I see now that we have 1 minute left to the break. And when we come back, I want to talk a little more about ancient history, because if you read the history books of today, there is fallacies and there is all kinds of stuff in it that don't make sense. So let's come back after the break and talk about ancient history and where maybe this cool dude, Jesus, fits in.
You're listening to the Universal Consciousness Show.
The Universal Consciousness Show.
Your weekly connection to the truth.
You get to really sort of enjoy a bizarre ride.
Share your knowledge by calling our hotline number at 702-425-9230. That's 702-425-9230.
Call now.
Worldwide callers, find us on Skype at KCOR Radio. It's time to abandon your fear and question what you think you know.
And now, if you will, accompany me on a journey to the future.
More awakening awaits.
After this, after this, after this, after this, after this, after this.
Looking for intelligent talk? Then look no further. Expedition Truth. Expedition Truth. Hosted by Jack Ashcraft. Live on Thursdays, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. From spirituality and prophecies to philosophy, politics and science, and so much more, Expedition Truth is setting new standards for what intelligent talk radio should be. Jack explores all of the hot topics, as well as interviews some of the most respected academics and authors in their respective fields today. Expedition Truth. Live on Thursdays, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Intelligent talk for the discerning mind, because the truth never fears questions.
Hello, KCOR listeners. Lorian Fenton here from the Fenton Files to tell you about UFOCon 2020 in San Francisco, February 20th through 23rd. A conference like no other, UFOCon is where experiencers are going to reveal new information and science and consciousness will collide. So get your tickets at UFOCon2020.com. That's UFOCon2020.com. Don't miss what will be the most talked about conference of the decade.
If ever a breed was affectionate to a fault, it's the Golden Retriever. They're people dogs, pure and simple. And the Golden Retriever Rescue of Southern Nevada needs your help. If you would like to volunteer, foster, adopt, or donate, go to the Golden Retriever Rescue of Southern Nevada's website at grrsn.org. That's grrsn.org. Or call 598-GOLD. That's 598-GOLD.
They say that the truth is stranger than fiction. What if they are one and the same?
It's a life form, unlike anything we know, not cellular but electrical in nature, extremely intelligent.
Join Dave Emmons, host of The Strange Truth, every Thursday night at 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. Eastern, as he connects the dots that others miss. The Strange Truth is a groundbreaking 2-hour talk show that interviews the hottest UFO experts, experiencers, whistleblowers, and spiritual masters from around the world.
A tool for people to connect with the universe and begin to understand it.
The Strange Truth. It digs deep into current events, the extraterrestrial contact phenomenon, explores suppressed history, and dissects false flag conspiracy, all while expanding your spiritual ascendance.
What was that name again?
The Strange Truth, hosted by Dave Emmons, live every Thursday night at 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. Come get tomorrow's news today.
Going live in 3, 2, 1.
It's time, once again, to unravel the mysteries of the universe by connecting the dots to a higher consciousness. This is the Universal Consciousness Show.
The Universal Consciousness Show.
Now the world will begin hearing us.
Share your knowledge by calling 702-425-9230. That's 702-425-9230. Worldwide callers use Skype name KCOR Radio.
It's as simple as that.
Find us on Twitter at KCOR Radio or use hashtag KCOR. Even better, join us on the live chat at KCORradio.com. Back to your enlightened hosts, Agi Nast and Diana Serafin.
Hello, hello. We are back with the Universal Consciousness Show, and we are talking with David Collis. We've been talking about this cool dude that people know as Jesus and how he fits into history and what happened back there. And there is some evidence to the existence of the guy. In fact, when I wrote a book about some of these things myself, and I found that there is a wanted poster that is actually in the surviving Roman records where they explain what he looked like, and he was used by 3 names. So yes, he did exist. But how does he fit into ancient history? Where maybe did he get his information from? And I want to talk to David about maybe a little bit of Jewish history, maybe even further back possibly into ancient history. So where do you think we should start out there, David?
Well, let's just think about the nature of Jesus and where he fits in with Jewish history and whether or not he's part of this continuum of Jewish history and Jewish patriarchs. I mean, that's an interesting concept in and of itself. So, when after Jesus's death, the Christians, and we know this because there's an existing letter, and I think the letter was Barnabas, who wrote and said that right after Jesus's death, the Christians that's what they were referred to at the time. Actually, it's called the Way, but the early proto-Christians seemed to be very, very fascinated with the Old Testament and whether or not there was prophetic utterances in the Old Testament that pointed to Jesus. And so when we read the New Testament Gospels, we're going to find that these writers are now using earlier texts from the Old Testament and using those particular verses to promote Jesus in a particular manner. So we're looking at what they thought of Jesus, and I was interested in trying to understand what did Jesus think of himself.
Yeah, actually, what he thinks of himself, that is probably not very well understood. There is a book, and I got it on the bookshelf right in front of me, actually. The title of the book is The Jesus Papers, because in Jerusalem, there was a box that was found in the ground when somebody was digging in the ground to create a basement of his house. And inside the box, there were old papers. And he had it translated. And it showed up. It's written in the book where actually this was supposed to be when Joshua Bet Halachme was taken before the court, before they went and did unspeakable things to him. He wrote a paper in his defense. And in there he said, I am not God. I am only a man that has the Spirit of God within me. So he did not claim to be God. That organized religion has come up with that. But this is, and I believe there's something to this paper. It looked really real.
Listen,
what do you think of?
I love that. And so that aligns with my understanding as well. So let's, we wanted to kind of dig into a little bit of Jewish history. So let's just go ahead and dig into this, because this is going to be the crux of a lot of issues, because things are going to be coming to a funnel and to a point, and there's a number of issues that need to be unpacked. So the first one you can say is, what's a Messiah and what's the purpose of the Messiah? And then the other one is what's going on in Judea that requires a Messiah? And then why are they talking about the end of days? So, Jesus is going to be thrown into this mix. So there's already this, this big monumental issue that was historical kind of unraveling or unfolding that was taking place. So Messiah was the person who was anointed by God. So in your papers, Jesus is saying that I felt like I was anointed. Well, that's consistent with anybody who felt that they were anointed by God. They would be considered a Messiah. But the question becomes, what did the Jews understand that to be? And so, one, you had to be anointed. Two, there was going to be a political deliverance of the country from the oppression that is coming from the Greco-Roman world. And the Jews were desperate to try to get out from underneath this this condition, right? So in their history, when they have been subjected, there has always been somebody who has been able to, in a sense, deliver them from the suppression. You can see it in their Old Testament, you're going to see, Noah was supposed to be, deliver all of his family and the animals from the wrath of God, and you had to build the ark. There's that type of archetype. We have the archetype of Moses delivering his people from Egypt and crossing the Red Sea and then going into the Promised Land. We have the archetypes of Saul and David to create a new state and then, do away with the Philistines. So we're seeing this concept in which there is this promised land, and within the promised land, you have to act and be a certain way, and then if it's under stress, then there's the Messiah that's going to right all the problems. And so at the time of the Roman occupation in the first century, Judea was ripe with these kind of concerns that they are being overrun by, people who were, whether they would be Egyptians or whether they be up from the north or they be in the Greek and the Roman Empire, or even from the east. They've always been at what I refer to as Grand Central Station from all these other empires. And these other empires put pressure on them. And so they're trying to find their own self-identity within this pressurized zone. So, at the time of Jesus is coming along and he feels anointed, and people are calling him the deliverer. So what are you being delivered of? Well, we're going to deliver ourselves from the Roman Empire. But is that really what Jesus was interested in?
Yeah. Yeah, and also in the Roman records, they refer to him as Messiah, which is our interpretation of, became the word Messiah. And he, like Joshua, never claimed to be, but there was a man living 100 years BC that they called him the teacher of righteousness. He claimed to be the Messiah. And he had a huge following of people, of the Essenes. And he also was crucified by the Romans, killed by the Romans, and there is evidence of him having been killed. And there's some similarities between them, and maybe I'm open to the fact that maybe there is some bleed over possibly into the stories of Jesus from the teacher of righteousness' life story, because he also was said to be walking on water, healing the sick, and raising the dead, and all these things that supposed to have happened.
That's correct. So we're going to start seeing a very strong influence of the Dead Seas on the early Christians. And here's one story. In fact, I've even read that there's one scholar who would like to believe that Jesus was the teacher of righteousness. I think that occurred earlier, like you're mentioning, but I think that he ends up, as an archetype, he ends up fulfilling this role. And oddly enough, at the time of the teacher of righteousness, there was also a man who arose who was referred to as the wicked priest. And it has been suggested that Paul, the Apostle Paul, was the wicked priest. So yes, the Dead Sea Scrolls are very fascinating. All of the groundwork for early Christianity are going to be contained within those writings. Mm-hmm. And the kind of the foreshadowing of Jesus's life is going to come out of that. And Jesus himself, there is an Essene influence. And so I went down and I looked, and in my book, I itemized all the ideas that are Essene, and then I looked at Jesus's ministry, and I'm going, well, that's Essene, and that's Essene, that's Essene. And then I recognized that there is a split. And now Jesus is going to start moving down a different path than the Essenes, but he's still adopting some of their ideas. Not necessarily dietary laws, but more of the what you look like, how you conduct yourself, what you think about pain, how you're committed to your ministry, how you join people together during a meal. Those are all the things that you would recognize in the Essenes that Jesus ended up, using as well. But there's another part and I write about this as well. There's another part about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essenes that was rather peculiar. And when you have somebody who is glorified in a way, there's all these people are going to write about that particular person in a very glowing manner. If there's somebody that comes up against that and challenges that, then there's this entire smear campaign. And when I was looking at the New Testament, I noticed that there was the same practice taking place.
Yeah.
So Jesus was the glow, he was being written about in very glowing terms, and anybody who was against him was not. And I even think that occurred to his own family. So we have the glorification of Jesus, we have the glorification of Mother Mary, but we don't have anything about Jesus's family, the rest of the family. So they're dismissed or not even brought into the picture. I think Mary Magdalene, she was completely discredited. She was being considered, essentially a prostitute.
Yeah.
So, and she was filled with demons. That to me is a smear campaign because you don't like her. So why are you not liking her? She might not be liked because she's trying to hold on to the true message that Jesus was promoting, and the others who are now starting to write the story went, no.
Yeah, and then again, she was the 13th disciple.
Yeah, so and I believe that she was a disciple of Jesus. I also believe that Jesus and she were married, but I also believe that she was a disciple, and that was part of the inclusion that he was interested in, that was trying to break those traditions that you find in the Middle Eastern practices, that women were they're not a slave, but they're not a full person.
Yeah, he changed that thinking, and I know I'm sitting here looking at your book, Interviewing Jesus the Man by David Collis, and you write very extensively about that, how he felt about women, and which went totally against the Jewish teachings.
Exactly. He wanted to educate them. The Jews didn't want to allow them the educational institutions. They didn't want them to have any of that. They didn't have a voice. They were only told if they got to get in and listen to some of the deep teachings, which I don't think they did, they would always have to keep their mouth shut. But the role for the women was what was referred to, the Romans referred this to as the hearth. So it was, the women were responsible for the house, and the house was very important. And that was pretty much what that was what their role was. Midwives, food, household issues, and
children.
Children, and raising children, and the men had other roles.
Yeah. Yeah. And it became very boring life sometimes for them, because they realized that they were treated as a lesser human.
Yes.
And I think there is writings about Maria Magdalena where she rebelled against that.
She, when I did analysis of Jesus, and then I asked myself, what kind of woman would do what kind of woman would actually follow Jesus, and what kind of woman would, if Jesus were married, what kind of woman would be most akin to his, kind of his spirituality, right? Mm-hmm. His personality. And I thought that Jesus was a very strong-headed personality. He also had, a lot of wisdom. And I can't imagine Mary being somebody who was very timid.
No.
And shy.
I don't think so at all.
So I felt she and Jesus were like kind of they were in the same car with the same mentality, with the same direction, with the same interests. And to me, when I really tried to work out all of the dynamics of that relationship, I realized that what I was looking at was a tragic love affair. The two of them, they were madly in love with each other, and Jesus felt that he kind of had to accept that. And so now we're dealing with the fact that Jesus is, he's a dead man walking, because all the things that he was doing was undermining existing order. And of course, one of the things the Jews didn't want is they didn't want to have any type of rebellion because they didn't want the wrath of the Romans to fall on them. And so Jesus was out there kind of turning tables, and he did it at a time during the Passover. Quite literally and physically, he did it at Passover, which is the equivalent of, the United States during their 4th of July celebration, and it's freedom from the British oppressors, in which we announced our own freedom, and that's what Passover is for the Jews. It's their freedom from Egypt. So here's the Romans going, we need to keep law and order, and you're celebrating your freedom from the Egyptians. Just think about the dynamic of that right there, of what the Romans must have felt like. Hey, at any time, something can turn into something very, very, it can turn into wildfire, and there could be a rebellion happening during this celebration. And there's Jesus out there flipping tables. So,
and I don't blame him.
It's jam-packed with all kinds of intrigue.
Yeah, I don't blame him at all. I would love to flip the table on the Federal Reserve.
Right, so now you can kind of go down our road and seeing what we're dealing with, and how we deal with the proverbial flipping of tables.
Yeah, in fact, in concept, nothing has changed, has it?
Well, there's always those who are in charge, and there's those who feel like those who are in charge are suppressing, the others.
Yeah. And for those out there that is doing research on their own into this, you may look for the title. I found the old written records referring to Maria as Maria Mene. That's what supposedly her contemporaries called her. That was kind of like, Mene was kind of like a loving title. So I don't know where the word Maria Magdalena comes from. I believe that is probably an organized name, the second one, but I don't know. I haven't found it anywhere, but Maria Mene I found. So that's something to look at for the researchers out there.
Well, what I was able to discover was it's Migdal. So there is a town called Migdal, and Migdal, this is very fascinating because when I was looking at Jesus's sayings about money and wealth and treasure, we have the mentality of somebody who owns like a plantation. We have the mentality of someone who is a merchant. We have somebody who has been involved with inheritance, and we have somebody who's involved with doing things with their hands, making money with their hands. So all of the issues when it came to the inheritance, the merchant, and the plantation owner, all of those ideas that Jesus knew, and he knew intimately, makes me believe that Jesus came from a family that was either, they were building something, they were growing something, and somehow they were selling something. And when you get into Migdal, we're seeing that Migdal was famous for salted fish. So salted fish at that time was what we would refer to as pizza today. I mean, it was so prevalent that people were making a lot of money off it, and I'm sure there wasn't too many families. So it wouldn't surprise me if Mary Magdalene was one of the families that had money from Migdal, and that her nickname was Magdalena.
Mm-hmm. That wouldn't surprise me at all. And I think also, I see we have 4 minutes left for the show here. So let's also make sure that you get your word out there where people can get your book and find out where they can connect with you, because I've been talking to you now for probably close to a year or so here in Tucson, and I see there is things that we talk about that you don't have in your book. There is more information coming here, so maybe there is another book cooking in you.
Well, I just feel like there is so much information that I wanted to talk about a lot of things, spirituality, the sacred journey, all those kind of things. That wasn't necessarily how I wanted to approach this particular material. I really wanted to understand the historical Jesus, what was going on at his time. And I felt like I wanted to create a little bit of as if I was kind of setting up this idea that I was a filmmaker and I was filming Jesus moving through the environment, talking and meeting people and challenging people. That's the way I kind of saw it. But there's so much other information that I have learned and have acquired, and that requires another book. And, whether it's of Jesus, I don't know yet. I left it open because I never even talked about Jesus's miracles.
Yeah.
That said, if my book is called Interviewing Jesus the Man, and it is it's set up as a dialogue between me and Jesus. And we were talking about his life and spirituality and his family and what was going on at the time and how he was responding to it. That's what I wanted to explore. Kind of is those missing year life, the missing years of his life, and then also his ministry. So that book is available on Amazon.com, and I have a print version of that. I have an audio version of that, and I also have an ebook version of that. I have a website, and it is www.davidcollis.com. And I am on Facebook. I am David C. Collis, and I also have David Collis Author. So you can look for me there as well.
Okay, that sounds good. Now, we have about a minute and a half left of the show. If you were going to talk to the whole world and they would listen, what would you tell them?
I'm going to go back to what Jesus said. The kingdom of heaven is inside of you. It's all around you. So how do you connect, one, to yourself, and two, once you connect to yourself, how do you connect to the divine? And how do you start living your life in alignment with the divine? Well, there are a number of traditions, and all of those traditions tend to be mystical, and those are the traditions that I explored. So I have there's a little saying that I like that I found. Can't remember who it came from, but it was, I went looking for God and I found myself. And when I found myself, I found God. And that's kind of where
there
I am
you go
today.
Yeah. Okay, we are now down to the end of the show, and I thank you very much, David. We've been talking to David Collis about his book, Interviewing Jesus the Man. So next week we will be here again. So until then, take care of each other.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been the Universal Consciousness Show.
The Universal Consciousness Show.
Your weekly guide to a deeper understanding of the all that we are.
Well, in a few years, it will be a matter of common sense to very many people that they're one with the universe. It will be so simple.
Live Mondays at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on the show, hosts, or their guests, please visit universal-consciousness-show.com. That's universal-consciousness-show.com. Remember, there's a shift coming. A new earthly paradigm. A shift to universal consciousness.
Universal consciousness.
This is KCOR Las Vegas, home of the Digital Radio Network, broadcasting from a shack just south of Area 51.
Wait, that doesn't exist.